Between 1839 and 1843, 12 enslaved workers on Thornhill Plantation in Louisiana died under circumstances the parish coroner refused to investigate. All 12 had served directly under the supervision of Madame Vera Thornhill, a woman whose 300-pound frame was matched only by the weight of her cruelty. In the scorching fields where cotton grew white as bone, she ruled from a specially constructed carriage, dispensing punishments that grew more inventive with each passing season. But in the spring of 1843, she pushed one man too far. A field hand named Marcus, who had endured 4 years of her particular brand of torment, finally reached the breaking point that would change everything. Before we continue with the story of Madame Thornhill and the reckoning that shook Louisiana's plantation country, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what you are about to hear has been buried in courthouse basements and private family archives for over 180 years. And I want to know where you are listening from tonight. Drop your state or city in the comments below. I am curious as how far this story travels. The weight of power and cruelty. Vera Thornhill had inherited Thornhill Plantation in 1835, following her husband's death from what the family physician diplomatically called consumption. Though the enslaved workers in the quarters whispered darker truths about the bruises found on his body and the terror in his eyes during his final weeks. At 38 years old and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Vera transformed from overlooked wife to absolute monarch of 4,000 acres, ruling with a combination of wealth, social connections, and a capacity for cruelty that made even other plantation owners uncomfortable during their carefully polite dinner parties. The plantation occupied prime land along the Mississippi River, 20 miles south of Baton Rouge, where the soil ran dark and rich enough to produce cotton that fetched premium prices at New Orleans auctions. 347 enslaved people worked the fields, the house, the stables, and the various outbuildings that kept the estate functioning. Among Louisiana's planter class, the Thornhill name carried weight that had nothing to do with Vera's physical presence, though her size became impossible to ignore once she assumed control of the property. Her husband, Thomas Thornhill, had been a moderate man by the standards of his time and place. He employed an overseer who used the whip sparingly, provided adequate rations to the workers, and generally operated under the philosophy that healthy slaves were profitable slaves. But Thomas had also been a weak man, physically slight and prone to illness, and his marriage to Vera had been arranged by families more interested in combining land holdings than in personal compatibility. What Thomas discovered too late was that Vera's quiet demeanor during their courtship masked something cold and calculating beneath. She had spent her girlhood in the shadow of 3 beautiful sisters who married well and often, while Vera was passed over repeatedly until her father's desperation and the Thornhill family's land hunger created an opportunity neither party could refuse. The humiliations of being the unwanted daughter, the overlooked wife, the woman whose size made her an object of whispered commentary at social gatherings. All of this accumulated in Vera's mind like compound interest on a debt she intended to collect. When Thomas died in 1835, whether from actual consumption or from something administered by a wife who had grown tired of his weakness, Vera discovered that ownership suited her better than marriage ever had. She dismissed the moderate overseer within a month and hired James Crawford, a man whose reputation for efficiency came with whispers about methods that other plantations found excessive. She ordered the construction of her reinforced carriage so she could personally supervise field work, without the indignity of attempting to walk on ground made uneven by cotton rows and her own considerable weight. By 1839, Thornhill Plantation had gained a reputation among enslaved people throughout Louisiana as a place to be avoided. Traders who brought human cargo to market knew that slaves sold to Vera Thornhill fetched lower prices because word had spread through the invisible networks that connected the enslaved across state lines. Thornhill was a death sentence delivered slowly through exhaustion and deliberate cruelty. The man who remembered freedom. Marcus had been born free in Charleston, the son of a freedman carpenter who had saved enough money to purchase his own shop and provide his family with something rare among black people in the South: hope for the future. But freedom built on paper can be destroyed by men with guns and legal documents. And when Marcus was 21 years old, slave catchers arrived with forged papers claiming he was escaped property from a Georgia plantation. By the time the truth might have been established, he had already been sold 3 times and arrived at Thornhill Plantation, where Madame Vera purchased him specifically for his literacy and skill with numbers. His father, Daniel, had insisted that both his sons learn to read and write, understanding that literacy was armor against a world that sought to keep black people powerless through ignorance. Marcus had attended a school for free black children operated by a Quaker family, where he learned not just letters and arithmetic, but also history and philosophy, ideas about natural rights and human dignity that his teachers believed applied to all people regardless of color. This education, meant to be protection, became the source of his greatest vulnerability. The night the slave catchers came, Marcus had been working late in his father's shop, finishing a cabinet commissioned by one of Charleston's wealthy merchants. He heard boots on the stairs, saw torchlight through the windows, and understood immediately what was happening even before the men burst through the door with weapons drawn, and papers they claimed proved his status as property. His father fought back, earning himself a rifle butt to the skull that left him bleeding on the workshop floor, while Marcus was dragged into the street in chains. The forged documents identified him as belonging to a Georgia planter named Hutchins, a man Marcus had never heard of, but who apparently had reported a slave of Marcus's description as having escaped 3 months prior. The fact that Marcus could prove he had been in Charleston his entire life meant nothing to men who made their living returning human beings to bondage, and it meant even less to the legal system that presumed black skin indicated slave status unless proven otherwise. By the time anyone might have investigated the document's authenticity, Marcus had been sold to a trader heading west toward Louisiana. He endured 2 other owners before Madame Vera purchased him in 1839 at a Baton Rouge auction. She had been looking for someone who could keep accurate records of cotton yields, manage the complex calculations involved in plantation accounting, and provide her with the information she needed to maximize profits. Marcus's literacy and numeracy made him valuable, but these same skills also marked him as dangerous in a system that depended on ignorance to maintain control. Madame Vera understood this contradiction perfectly, which was why she took particular pleasure in humiliating him whenever possible, reminding him that education meant nothing when the educated could be whipped like animals. Vera's mobile throne. The specially constructed carriage that carried Madame Vera through the cotton fields had been built by the plantation's blacksmith, according to her exact specifications, reinforced with extra iron to support her considerable weight, and fitted with a canopy to protect her from the Louisiana sun that burned the workers below. From this mobile throne, she would dispense orders and punishments, her voice carrying across the rows of cotton like the crack of the overseer's whip that frequently accompanied her pronouncements. The blacksmith, a man named Isaiah who had learned his trade from his father and grandfather before him, spent 3 months constructing the carriage during the winter of 1836. He understood what he was building, not merely a vehicle, but an instrument of Vera's power, a way for her to be physically present in the fields, without subjecting her body to the indignity of walking or the vulnerability of being at ground level with the workers she controlled. The design called for wheels wider than standard to distribute weight across soft field soil, iron reinforcement at every joint and stress point, and a seat platform raised high enough that Vera could look down on everyone around her. The canopy stretched above the seat like a small roof, made of canvas treated with wax to repel rain and dyed a deep green that Vera believed appropriately reflected her status. Curtains could be drawn on all sides when she desired privacy, though she rarely used them, preferring that workers see her presence, even from a distance. The carriage was pulled by two massive draft horses that had been specially trained to navigate the uneven terrain of cotton fields, stopping and starting on command, standing motionless for hours while Vera observed the work being done. Inside the carriage, Vera kept the tools of her authority within easy reach. A riding crop of braided leather that she used to strike workers who came close enough, though she rarely needed to dismount to inflict pain when she could simply order the overseer to administer punishment. A ledger book where she recorded production numbers and made notations about workers who failed to meet her expectations. A small bell that she would ring to summon the overseer or to signal when she wanted the carriage moved to a different section of the field. And a pistol, loaded and primed, resting in a specially made holster attached to the seat frame. The sound of the carriage approaching was enough to change the atmosphere in whatever section of the field it entered. Workers who had been talking would fall silent. Those who had paused even briefly to wipe sweat or rest aching muscles would resume their labor with renewed intensity. Children too young for field work but old enough to recognize danger would stop their playing and watch with the wariness of small animals sensing a predator. Madame Vera would sometimes sit in her carriage for hours without speaking, simply watching the workers move through the rows of cotton, her presence alone enough to ensure maximum effort. Other times, she would call out observations and criticisms in a voice that carried across the field. Marcus's descent into rage. The first time Madame Vera deliberately humiliated Marcus in front of the other workers, he was 25 years old and still possessed some fragment of the dignity his father had instilled in him during his years of freedom. She had called him to her carriage to review the cotton yield calculations he had prepared, then claimed loudly that his numbers were wrong, that an educated slave was more dangerous than useful, and that perhaps he needed to be reminded of his place through a public whipping. Marcus had stood beside the carriage holding the ledger he had spent hours preparing, every figure checked and rechecked, every calculation verified against the previous week's yields and the current weather conditions that affected picking rates. He knew the numbers were correct because mathematics did not lie, and because accuracy was the only form of pride he had left. But Madame Vera declared the ledger worthless, tore several pages from the book, and ordered the overseer to give Marcus 10 lashes for wasting her time with false accounting. The whipping itself was not the worst part, though the pain was considerable and the scars would remain on his back for the rest of his life. The worst part was standing at the whipping post while other workers were forced to watch, seeing in their eyes a mixture of pity and relief that it was him and not them. The worst part was hearing Madame Vera's voice from her carriage, narrating his punishment, like a schoolteacher explaining a lesson. This is what happens when slaves forget their station. This is the price of thinking yourself clever. This is the reminder that no amount of education changes what you are. Over the following 4 years, the humiliations accumulated like sediment, each one adding another layer to the rage that Marcus kept buried deep, where Madame Vera could not see it and use it against him. There was the time she ordered him to read aloud from a newspaper, while she ate her lunch in the carriage, then criticized his pronunciation and had him repeat passages until his voice grew hoarse. There was the morning she summoned him to explain a discrepancy in the supply records, then revealed it was a test. There was no discrepancy. She simply wanted to see if he would lie to cover his own imagined error. There was the afternoon she made him stand beside her carriage holding a parasol over her head for 3 hours, while she observed the cotton picking, his arms aching from the extended position, sweat running down his face, knowing that any movement to adjust his grip or ease his discomfort would be noticed and punished. There was the evening she called him to the big house to review accounts, then made him wait in the hallway for 4 hours while she entertained dinner guests, finally dismissing him near midnight without ever discussing the accounts at all. Each humiliation was calculated, designed not just to assert power, but to break something essential inside him, to destroy the sense of self that his father had worked so hard to build. But what Madame Vera did not understand was that humiliation has limits as a tool of control. Push too hard, too often, and it stops breaking people down and starts building something else inside them, something harder and more dangerous than obedience. When cruelty becomes murder. Sarah had been Marcus's wife in the only way enslaved people could be married, through promises spoken in the quarters and recognized by the community, even if not sanctioned by law or master. She was 19 years old, 5 months pregnant, and working in the fields on a July afternoon when the heat reached 108 degrees. Madame Vera, observing from her shaded carriage, noticed Sarah pause to wipe sweat from her face and rest one hand against her swollen belly. The temperature that day made even the hardest workers move slowly, their bodies struggling against heat that rose from the ground in visible waves and made the air itself feel solid. Sarah had been picking since dawn, her fingers bleeding from the sharp cotton bowls, her back aching from the constant bending, her swollen feet barely fitting into the work shoes that had been adequate before pregnancy changed her body's dimensions. When she paused to catch her breath and steady herself against the dizziness that had been troubling her all morning, she was not being lazy or rebellious. She was simply trying to survive. But Madame Vera saw the pause as defiance, an intolerable assertion of personal need over work requirements. She rang the bell that summoned the overseer and pointed at Sarah with her riding crop. That one has stopped working. She thinks her condition excuses idleness. Remind her that children are born in these fields every season, and their mothers return to work the same day. No special treatment for breeding. James Crawford, the overseer, approached Sarah with the resignation of a man following orders he knew were wrong but lacked the courage to refuse. He told her to return to work immediately, that rest breaks were not permitted regardless of circumstance, that Madame Vera was watching and expected compliance. Sarah tried to explain that she was not resting but had felt faint, that the baby was moving strangely, that something felt wrong inside her body. Crawford told her that feeling wrong was not the same as being unable to work, and that if she could stand, she could pick cotton. Sarah returned to work because she had no choice, moving down the row with mechanical determination, filling her sack with cotton, while her vision blurred and her body screamed warnings that she could not afford to heed. She worked for another hour before she collapsed, falling forward into the cotton plants, her body convulsing in the summer heat. By the time other workers reached her and called for help, she was unconscious, her skin burning with fever, her breathing shallow and irregular. The plantation's doctor was summoned from the big house, but he arrived too late to save either Sarah or the child she carried. Heat stroke combined with dehydration and the physical stress of pregnancy had created a medical crisis that primitive 19th century medicine could not reverse. Sarah died that evening in the quarters, surrounded by women who tried to cool her fever and pray her back to life, while Marcus held her hand and felt everything he had left to lose slip away. James Crawford's complicity. James Crawford had worked as overseer at Thornhill Plantation for 6 years, and in that time he had developed a particular skill for executing Madame Vera's orders while maintaining just enough distance from her worst cruelties to sleep at night. He was not a kind man by any measure, but he understood that dead slaves represented lost investment, and Madame Vera's increasing brutality was destroying property that should have been maintained for profit. Crawford had come to Louisiana from Virginia, where he had worked on tobacco plantations that operated under slightly less brutal conditions than the cotton estates that dominated the Deep South. He understood the mechanics of plantation management, the balance between pushing workers hard enough to maximize production while keeping them healthy enough to work year after year. He knew that consistent, adequate rations, basic medical care, and punishment, severe enough to maintain control, but not so extreme as to damage valuable property, made economic sense, even if it had nothing to do with mercy. But Madame Vera did not operate according to economic logic when her ego was involved. She punished workers not just for actual infractions but for perceived disrespect, for failing to show sufficient deference, for existing in ways that reminded her of her own vulnerabilities. Crawford had learned to anticipate her moods, to recognize when she arrived at the fields already angry about something unrelated to cotton yields, when her humiliation of workers would be more theatrical than usual, when his role was not to manage slaves, but to perform cruelty for an audience of one. The death of Sarah troubled Crawford more than most of the violence he had witnessed or participated in during his years at Thornhill. The woman had been obviously struggling, visibly pregnant, and the heat that day had been dangerous even for healthy workers. He had known that forcing her to continue working was likely to result in serious harm. But he had also known that questioning Madame Vera's orders would cost him his position, and possibly worse. So he had made the choice that overseers made daily on plantations across the South. He had valued his own security over another human being's life. But Sarah's death created complications beyond moral discomfort. Marcus was a valuable worker whose literacy and skills made him difficult to replace, and Crawford had noticed the man's increasing silence in the weeks following his wife's death, a quiet that felt more dangerous than the grief-driven rage that had consumed other men who lost loved ones. There was also the practical matter that Sarah's death had been witnessed by dozens of workers who knew exactly what had happened and why, and such knowledge spread through the quarters and between plantations, creating resentment that could erupt into rebellion if not carefully managed. Crawford tried to approach Madame Vera about the escape incident, suggesting that perhaps more care should be taken with pregnant workers during extreme heat, framing his concern in economic rather than humanitarian terms. But Vera dismissed his worries with a wave of her hand. Where secrets were traded, the kitchen existed in a strange liminal space between the world of enslaved field workers and the world of white privilege, a place where house servants overheard conversations not meant for their ears and learned secrets that could be traded like currency among those who possessed nothing else. Dinah had worked in Madame Vera's kitchen for 12 years, and she had become expert at appearing deaf while listening to everything. At 53 years old, Dinah had survived more owners than she cared to count, having been sold 4 times before arriving at Thornhill Plantation, when Thomas Thornhill still lived, and the estate operated under more moderate conditions. She had learned early that survival for house servants depended on managing the contradiction of being simultaneously invisible and indispensable, present enough to anticipate needs before they were spoken, but absent enough that white folks forgot you were human and said things they would never voice in front of people they considered real. The kitchen occupied a separate building behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway but far enough removed that cooking fires could not threaten the mansion itself. Inside, brick ovens and iron stoves produced meals that fed not just Madame Vera, but also the various white overseers, managers, and occasional guests who visited the plantation. Dinah supervised 2 younger women who did the actual heavy labor of cooking, while she focused on the skilled work of preparing dishes to Madame Vera's exacting specifications and managing the household's food supplies. But Dinah's real value lay in information she gathered while moving through the big house delivering meals, clearing dishes, and performing the countless small tasks that made her presence expected and therefore invisible. She heard Madame Vera's conversations with visitors, complaints about workers who needed to be punished, plans for purchasing new slaves at upcoming auctions, financial concerns about falling cotton prices and rising debts. She observed which house servants were summoned to Madame Vera's private chambers and noticed their haunted expressions when they returned. She saw the ledgers that Marcus prepared and heard Madame Vera discussing how to extract more work from fewer workers. All of this information flowed from the big house to the quarters through Dinah's careful whispers, warnings about which workers were being watched, advance notice when punishment was planned, intelligence about Madame Vera's moods and intentions that allowed people to prepare for what was coming. This network of communication was dangerous. Discovery would mean brutal punishment, but it was also essential for survival, a system designed to keep enslaved people isolated and powerless. After Sarah's death, Dinah paid particular attention to any conversation involving Marcus. She had known Sarah slightly, had sometimes given the young woman extra food from the kitchen when pregnancy made her constantly hungry, had mourned her death as one more tragedy in a long list of tragedies that defined plantation life. But Dinah also recognized that Marcus's grief was different from normal mourning, more focused, more dangerous. She had seen men break under the weight of loss, watched them descend into despair, or explode in suicidal rage that ended with their bodies hanging from trees as warnings to others. Marcus was different. His grief was cold rather than hot, controlled rather than explosive. When Dinah saw him, she noticed that his eyes tracked Madame Vera's movements with the attention of someone planning something. Vera's private chamber of horrors. What happened in Madame Vera's private chambers after dark was spoken of only in whispers among those who survived the experience, and some things were never spoken of at all. She would summon young male slaves to her bedroom under various pretexts, and what occurred behind those locked doors combined sexual exploitation with psychological torture in ways that left men broken in spirit even when their bodies bore no visible marks. The summons usually came through Dinah or another house servant, delivered in tones that suggested routine domestic tasks. Madame Vera required someone to move furniture in her bedroom or to bring firewood for the night, or to repair a window latch that had come loose. The pretexts were transparent to everyone involved, but they maintained the fiction of propriety that allowed what happened next to remain officially unacknowledged. A man would arrive at Madame Vera's chamber door after the rest of the household had retired, knock quietly, and be admitted into a room where the normal rules of plantation hierarchy underwent a grotesque inversion. Inside those chambers, Madame Vera exercised power in its most personal and violating forms. The men she summoned were typically young, strong, physically attractive by conventional standards, workers whose bodies had not yet been destroyed by field labor. She would order them to undress while she remained clothed, examining them with the same calculating assessment she used when purchasing new slaves at auction. She would comment on their physiques, comparing them to other men she had summoned, discussing their bodies as if they were livestock being evaluated for breeding. What followed combined sexual exploitation with deliberate humiliation designed to break men psychologically. Madame Vera would force them to perform acts that violated every assumption about power and race in Southern society, turning the social order inside out while making clear that this inversion existed only within her bedroom, and only by her permission. She would mock them for their participation in acts she herself commanded, call them degrading names, remind them that their compliance proved their fundamental worthlessness as human beings. The psychological damage exceeded the physical violation. Men who survived these encounters found themselves trapped in impossible contradictions. They had been forced to participate in acts they found degrading, yet speaking of what happened, risked punishment for making accusations against a white woman. They had witnessed Madame Vera's vulnerability, her naked body, her private desires. Yet this knowledge only made them more powerless because it gave her additional incentive to ensure their silence. They had experienced a form of intimacy that Southern society insisted could not exist between white women and black men, yet this intimacy was entirely predicated on their absolute powerlessness. Some men handled the experience by retreating into silence, refusing to discuss what happened, and trying to forget. Others drank when they could access alcohol, seeking oblivion as antidote to memory. A few attempted to escape, preferring the risks of flight to the prospect of future summons. And one man, a field hand named Benjamin, had hanged himself in the quarters rather than answer another summons, his suicide note specifically naming what Madame Vera had done to him. May 12, 1843. The morning began like any other morning during cotton growing season, with workers roused from the quarters before dawn and marched to fields where the plants were already waist-high and demanding constant attention. Marcus had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of Sarah and the child he would never meet, buried now in the potter's field beyond the quarters where enslaved people were interred without markers or ceremonies. He rose when the bell rang, dressed in the rough cotton shirt and trousers that constituted field workers' uniforms, and joined the line of people moving toward the fields in the gray light before sunrise. The morning air held a hint of coolness that would burn away within hours once the Louisiana sun climbed high enough to turn the fields into furnaces. Marcus carried his cotton sack, the same one he had carried every day for 4 years, its rough fabric stained with plant matter and sweat and the invisible marks of endless repetition. The work began as it always began, with workers spreading out along the rows and starting the mechanical process of picking cotton bolls from plants, stuffing the white fiber into sacks that grew heavier with each passing hour. Marcus worked in silence, his hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who had performed the same motions thousands of times. But unlike other mornings, when he could lose himself in the rhythm of labor and let his mind drift toward memories of Charleston or fantasies of impossible freedom, today he found himself unable to stop thinking about Sarah. 8 months had passed since her death, but the grief had not diminished so much as transformed into something denser and harder, a weight he carried everywhere that made every breath feel like effort. He thought about the last conversation they had shared the night before she died, when she had told him she could feel the baby moving and had smiled despite the exhaustion that made her face look older than her 19 years. He thought about finding her body in the quarters that evening, already cooling, the women around her weeping while he stood frozen, unable to process that she was gone. He thought about the fact that Madame Vera had never acknowledged Sarah's death, had never offered even the minimal courtesy of recognizing that something had been lost. To Vera, Sarah had been property that stopped functioning, an investment that failed to provide expected returns. Nothing more. The baby had never even achieved the status of potential property since it died before birth. In Madame Vera's accounting, Sarah's death was merely a line item, a financial loss that annoyed her, but did not trouble her conscience because she did not recognize that enslaved people possessed attributes that required moral consideration. This was what Marcus could not stop thinking about as he picked cotton that morning. Not just Sarah's death, but the absolute indifference with which it had been received by the woman responsible. Madame Vera had killed Sarah as surely as if she had held a gun to her head, and she had felt nothing. Vera's fatal miscalculation. Madame Vera's carriage arrived at the field mid-morning, earlier than usual, and the workers knew from experience that early arrival meant she was in a particularly foul mood and looking for reasons to punish someone. She called Marcus to her side, demanded to see the morning's picking counts, and then declared loudly that the numbers were falsified, that he was not only incompetent, but dishonest, and that such deception deserved public correction. Marcus approached the carriage with the picking ledger he had been maintaining, every entry carefully recorded, every number accurate because he had learned that precision was the only defense against Madame Vera's arbitrary accusations. The morning's counts showed production slightly below the previous week's average, which was expected given that several workers were sick and the remaining laborers were picking up their slack. The numbers told a story of people working as hard as physically possible under difficult circumstances. But Marcus knew that Madame Vera would not see the story, only the shortfall. She snatched the ledger from his hands without looking at it, her face already arranged in an expression of theatrical displeasure. "These numbers are wrong," she announced loudly enough for workers in nearby rows to hear. "You have falsified the counts to hide the laziness of your fellow slaves. You think yourself clever because you can write. But literacy in a slave is like a pocket watch on a pig. Absurd and useless." Marcus stood beside the carriage, fighting to keep his face neutral, to show none of the rage building inside him. The numbers were not wrong. He knew this with absolute certainty because mathematics did not care about Madame Vera's moods or need to humiliate someone to make herself feel powerful. Madame Vera continued her performance, holding the ledger up as if it were evidence in a trial. "This is what happens when slaves are given education above their station. They begin to think themselves equal to their betters. They imagine that knowing letters changes their fundamental nature. But you are still property, Marcus. Valuable property, perhaps, but property nonetheless. And property that malfunctions must be corrected." She gestured to the overseer, who had been standing at a discreet distance but close enough to respond to commands. "James Crawford, give this slave 10 lashes for falsifying plantation records. Do it here, where everyone can witness what happens to those who lie to their mistress." Crawford approached with visible reluctance, but Marcus knew the overseer would follow orders regardless of his personal feelings. The system did not allow for moral courage when it conflicted with white authority. Madame Vera then added a detail that transformed routine punishment into deliberate degradation. "Before you whip him, have him kneel beside my carriage and apologize for his dishonesty. I want to hear him admit his lie and beg forgiveness." This was the moment when something inside Marcus finally broke. Not the order to be whipped. He had endured that before. Not even the false accusation. He had learned to live with Madame Vera's arbitrary cruelties. But the demand that he kneel and apologize for honesty, that he participate in his own humiliation by speaking words that validated her lies. This was the thing he could not do. The moment of decision. When fear becomes fury, when Madame Vera ordered Marcus to kneel beside her carriage so she could strike him with the riding crop she kept for such purposes, something fundamental broke inside him. It was not the physical pain he feared. He had endured worse, but the deliberate degradation, the performance of his humiliation for the entertainment of a woman who had already taken everything from him. Marcus stood motionless beside the carriage, the ledger still clutched in his hands, while every worker within sight stopped picking cotton to watch what would happen next. The silence in the field was complete except for the sound of Madame Vera's breathing, audible even from several feet away, labored from the heat and her considerable weight. James Crawford stood with his whip coiled in one hand, waiting for Marcus to comply with the order to kneel, so the punishment could proceed according to the established ritual of plantation discipline. But Marcus did not kneel. He stood looking at Madame Vera's face, really looking at her for the first time in 4 years, seeing not the terrifying authority figure who controlled every aspect of his existence, but simply a woman whose power depended entirely on his willingness to participate in his own subjugation. She held no whip herself, could not physically force him to do anything, relied completely on the system of violence and law that stood behind her commands to transform her words into compliance. In that moment of clarity, Marcus understood that fear had been the chain that bound him more securely than any iron shackles. Fear of pain, fear of death, fear of making his situation worse. Fear that had kept him obedient, even as that obedience slowly destroyed everything that made him human. but Sarah was already dead. The life he had known in Charleston was irretrievably lost. The future held nothing but more days like this one, more humiliations, more watching Madame Vera destroy people while maintaining the fiction that she was civilized, and they were property. What did he have left to lose? The question crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. They could kill him, certainly, but they were killing him anyway, just more slowly. They could hurt him, but he had been hurt so often that pain had become just another constant in a life made of suffering. They could take away his privileges, but what privileges did an enslaved man possess that were worth protecting through continued submission? Madame Vera's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with the irritation of someone whose orders have not been instantly obeyed. I said, "Kneel, Marcus. Do not make me repeat myself. Your defiance will only increase your punishment. Kneel and apologize, or the lashes will be doubled." Still, Marcus stood, and something in his posture, a straightening of his spine, a slight shift in how he held his head, communicated that he had made a decision that could not be unmade. Crawford saw it first, and took an involuntary step backward, recognizing the look of a man who had moved beyond fear into that dangerous territory, where consequences no longer mattered. Workers in the surrounding rows saw it too, and the quality of the silence changed from the usual oppressive quiet of people afraid to draw attention to themselves into something electric with anticipation. Madame Vera, seated in her elevated carriage and accustomed to instant obedience, took longer to recognize that something had shifted fundamentally. When she finally understood that Marcus was not going to kneel, her face transformed from irritation to genuine anger, and then to something else entirely, the first flicker of fear. What Marcus did, the act that shocked Louisiana. The details of what happened next would be argued over in courtrooms and whispered about in parlors across Louisiana for years afterward, but the essential facts were undisputed. Marcus rose from his kneeling position, turned to face Madame Vera in her reinforced carriage, and spoke words that no enslaved person had ever dared speak to her. Then, before the overseer could intervene, before anyone could stop what was already inevitable, Marcus reached up and pulled Madame Vera from her carriage. The words Marcus spoke were recorded by multiple witnesses, though newspaper accounts would later refuse to print them in full, describing them only as inflammatory statements of the most dangerous character. But the workers in the field that day heard every syllable, and they carried those words back to the quarters where they were repeated, memorized, and eventually transmitted to other plantations through the invisible networks of communication that connected enslaved people across the state. "You killed my wife," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the cotton field with unusual clarity. "You worked her to death in this heat while she was carrying my child, and you felt nothing. You have tortured me for 4 years, humiliated me, tried to break me, all because you are a miserable woman who mistakes cruelty for power. You are not my mistress, you are not my better. You are nothing but a hateful creature who will die alone and unmourned, and I am done pretending otherwise." The words themselves were shocking enough, but what Marcus did next transformed speech into action that could not be explained away or minimized. He dropped the ledger he had been holding, stepped forward to the carriage, and before Madame Vera could process what was happening, or James Crawford could move to intervene, Marcus grabbed the front of her dress with both hands and pulled her forward out of her elevated seat. Madame Vera's weight, which she had used as an instrument of intimidation throughout her reign over Thornhill Plantation, now became the mechanism of her humiliation. She was not a small woman who could easily resist being pulled from her seat, but neither was she agile enough to brace herself against Marcus's sudden action. She tumbled forward from the carriage with a cry of shock and fear, her considerable mass giving her momentum that Marcus could not have stopped even if he had wanted to. Which he did not. The physics of her fall were simple and brutal. 300 pounds of human body impacting ground that had been baked hard by the Louisiana sun created a sound that workers would later describe as similar to a melon dropped from a wagon. Madame Vera hit the ground between the cotton rows with her arms ineffectually stretched out to break her fall, but her weight was too much for her wrists to support, and she collapsed face first into the dirt with an impact that drove the air from her lungs and left her gasping. For a moment, no one moved. The scene seemed frozen in time, Marcus standing over Madame Vera's prone body, Crawford with his whip still coiled and his expression showing absolute shock. Workers in nearby rows staring at the impossible sight of their owner lying in the dirt, unable to rise. Then Madame Vera made a sound, not quite a scream, but a noise of pain and humiliation and rage all combined, and she tried to push herself up from the ground. The fall. 300 pounds of consequence. Madame Vera's body hit the ground with an impact that field workers would later describe as sounding like a cotton bale dropped from a wagon. Her weight, which she had used as an instrument of intimidation, now became the mechanism of her destruction. She attempted to rise, but her legs could not support her on the uneven ground, and as she struggled, Marcus stood over her speaking in a voice that carried across the field. The immediate physical consequences of the fall were severe. Madame Vera's left wrist, which had taken the brunt of the impact, broke with a sound that several nearby workers heard distinctly. Her nose struck the ground hard enough to split open, blood immediately pouring down her face and soaking into the cotton field dirt. Her ribs, compressed by the impact and the weight of her own body, cracked audibly, though whether any fully broke would be disputed in later medical examinations. And her right ankle, twisted beneath her as she fell, suffered damage that would leave her unable to walk properly for the rest of her life. But the physical injuries, though painful and significant, were secondary to the psychological destruction of being pulled from her elevated position and left struggling in the dirt like one of the workers she had spent years humiliating. Madame Vera had constructed her entire identity around the maintenance of authority, the performance of superiority, the visible demonstration that she existed in a different category of being than the enslaved people who worked her land. Her carriage had been the physical manifestation of this hierarchy, keeping her literally above the workers, protected from the dirt and heat that defined their existence. Now she lay in that same dirt, her face pressed against earth still damp from the previous night's dew and mixed with her own blood, her body unable to right itself, despite her increasingly desperate attempts. She tried to push herself up using her right arm, but the broken left wrist could not support any weight, and she collapsed again with a cry of pain. She tried to roll onto her side, but the uneven ground and her own mass made the movement impossible without help that no one was offering. Marcus stood over her, making no move to help or to continue the violence, simply watching as Madame Vera struggled with the basic physics of her own body. His face showed no expression of triumph or satisfaction, only a kind of exhausted finality, as if he had completed a task that needed doing regardless of the consequences. Behind him, James Crawford finally broke from his frozen shock and began moving toward them. But his steps were slow, hesitant, as if he was uncertain whether his role was to help Madame Vera, or to restrain Marcus, or simply to witness what was happening. The workers in the surrounding rows had stopped even pretending to pick cotton. Everyone who could see the carriage was watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from horrified fascination to barely concealed satisfaction. Some of them had been personally brutalized by Madame Vera over the years. Others had watched loved ones suffer under her regime. All of them had dreamed, at least occasionally, of seeing her brought low, though none had imagined it would actually happen, or that it would look like this, undignified and pathetic and somehow smaller than the authority she had wielded. Madame Vera finally managed to roll onto her side, and from this position, she could see the faces watching her from the cotton rows. She saw their expressions, registered their lack of concern or sympathy, understood in that moment how thoroughly she was hated. The words that could not be unspoken. What Marcus said as Madame Vera lay in the dirt was recorded by 3 different witnesses and later entered into court testimony, though the words were considered so inflammatory that newspapers refused to print them in full. He spoke of Sarah's death and the 12 others who had died under Vera's supervision. He detailed the private humiliations, the sexual exploitation, the deliberate cruelties that served no purpose except to satisfy her appetite for others' suffering. Marcus spoke in a voice that was calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing weather or crop yields rather than delivering an indictment that would seal his fate. He addressed his words not to Madame Vera specifically, but to the assembled workers, to James Crawford, to anyone within hearing distance, as if he understood that what mattered now was not changing Vera's behavior, but creating a record that could not be erased, testimony that would survive even if he did not. "You worked Sarah to death," he said, his voice steady and clear. "She told you she was feeling faint. She told you the baby was in distress. You ordered her back to work anyway, because you cared more about cotton yields than human life. She died that night, and our child died with her, and you never acknowledged it. You never even pretended to care. To you, she was just property that stopped functioning. To me, she was everything." He continued, each sentence adding another layer to the catalog of Madame Vera's crimes. "You have beaten me for telling the truth. You have humiliated me in front of others to satisfy your own need to feel powerful. You have summoned men to your bedroom at night and forced them to participate in acts that left them broken, then threatened them into silence about what you did. You operate this plantation like your own private torture chamber, and everyone here knows it. But no one says anything because you are white and wealthy and we are nothing." Marcus turned slightly to look at James Crawford, who had stopped approaching and now stood several feet away, still holding his whip but making no move to use it. "You know everything I am saying is true," Marcus said to the overseer. "You have watched it all happen. You have participated in it. You have given the orders that carried out her cruelty. You could have stopped some of it, but you chose your wages over doing what was right. You are as guilty as she is, just less powerful." Then Marcus looked down at Madame Vera, who had managed to prop herself into a sitting position but remained on the ground, her face a mask of blood and dirt and impotent rage. "And you," he said, speaking directly to her for the first time. "You are the worst kind of evil because you think your cruelty is justified. You genuinely believe that being white and wealthy gives you the right to treat human beings like animals. You mistake your position for virtue, your power for righteousness, but you are not righteous. You are not superior. You are just someone who happened to be born into circumstances that gave you control over others, and you used that control to destroy people because it made you feel less miserable about your own pathetic existence." The words hung in the air, impossible to take back, impossible to pretend had not been spoken. Every enslaved person within hearing distance had just witnessed a man speak truth to power in a way that violated every rule of the system that governed their lives. Every white person present, James Crawford primarily, had heard accusations that could not be officially acknowledged without undermining the entire structure of plantation society. The overseer's choice, Crawford's moment of truth. James Crawford stood 20 feet away with a rifle in his hands, and everyone in the field knew he could shoot Marcus dead with legal justification, and probably a bonus from the Thornhill family. But Crawford did not shoot. He stood watching as Marcus spoke his truth over Madame Vera's prone form, and his failure to act immediately would later cost him his position and his reputation. Crawford's hesitation had multiple sources, none of them particularly noble, but all of them sufficient to freeze him in place while the scene unfolded. First, there was simple shock at what he was witnessing. In 6 years as overseer at Thornhill Plantation, he had seen enslaved people punished, tortured, worked to death, but he had never seen one openly defy a white owner and physically assault them. The sheer impossibility of what Marcus had done created a kind of psychological paralysis that made Crawford temporarily unable to process how to respond. Second, there was the uncomfortable recognition that everything Marcus was saying was true. Crawford had watched Sarah work in the deadly heat while visibly pregnant. He had delivered the order that sent her back to work despite her clear distress. He had participated in countless other cruelties over the years, following Madame Vera's commands, even when he knew they were excessive or cruel, or likely to result in death. He had told himself that he was just doing his job, that the responsibility lay with Madame Vera, who gave the orders, rather than with him, who merely executed them. But Marcus's words stripped away that comfortable fiction and forced Crawford to confront his own complicity. Third, there was a more pragmatic calculation happening beneath Crawford's shock and discomfort. If he shot Marcus now, he would be killing one of the plantation's most valuable workers, someone whose literacy and numerical skills made him difficult and expensive to replace. The economic loss would be significant, and Madame Vera, despite her current humiliation, would not thank Crawford for destroying valuable property in a moment of zealous enforcement. Better to capture Marcus alive, let the legal system determine his fate, and preserve the investment even if the man himself would eventually be executed through proper channels. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, Crawford was witnessing something that every overseer feared but rarely saw. The moment when an enslaved person moved beyond fear and became genuinely dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. Crawford had been trained to recognize this transformation, to watch for signs that someone was planning rebellion or escape, to identify and neutralize threats before they could spread to other workers. But Marcus had moved from obedient to dangerous so quickly that Crawford had missed the transition until it was already too late to prevent. The rifle in Crawford's hands remained pointed generally in Marcus's direction, but not raised to firing position. His finger stayed outside the trigger guard. His posture communicated uncertainty rather than readiness to shoot, and critically, he did not call for assistance from other white men on the plantation who could have surrounded Marcus and ended the confrontation through overwhelming force. Instead, Crawford stood frozen while Marcus finished speaking, while Madame Vera struggled to rise from the dirt while dozens of enslaved workers watched to see what would happen next. His inaction created a space where something impossible continued to exist, where a black man stood over a white woman speaking truths that were supposed to remain forever unspoken, where the normal order of the plantation remained suspended in a moment that everyone present understood would never come again. When Marcus finally fell silent and made no move either to help Madame Vera or to flee the scene, Crawford finally stirred into action, but even then his movements were slow, almost reluctant. The spread of rebellion. When truth becomes contagion. What happened in the cotton field that morning spread through the quarters by noon and reached neighboring plantations by evening, carried by the invisible networks of communication that enslaved people maintained despite every effort to isolate them. The story grew with each telling. Marcus, who pulled down the massive Madame Vera. Marcus, who spoke truth that could not be unspoken. Marcus, who reminded them all that even the most powerful could be made to fall. The communication network that connected enslaved people across Louisiana operated through multiple channels, each adapted to the surveillance and restrictions that plantation owners imposed to prevent exactly this kind of information sharing. Drivers who transported goods between plantations carried news along with their legitimate cargo, speaking in careful code about events at other estates. Enslaved people hired out to work on neighboring properties for short periods returned with intelligence about conditions elsewhere. Those who could read, a small minority, sometimes had access to newspapers that mentioned plantation sales or legal proceedings that revealed information about other estates. But the most important channel was simply conversation between people who managed to meet during the brief periods when movement between plantations was possible. Sunday gatherings at churches that served multiple estates, weddings or funerals that brought together enslaved people from different properties, chance encounters along roads when workers were traveling on errands for their owners. These moments of connection created a communication web that slaveholders could disrupt, but never completely eliminate. The story of Marcus pulling Madame Vera from her carriage spread through this network with unusual speed because it contained elements that made it compelling to people who lived under constant oppression. First, it was a story about someone fighting back against a particularly cruel owner, and such tales gave hope to people who felt powerless. Second, it involved a woman slaveholder being humiliated by a male slave, which inverted multiple hierarchies simultaneously, both racial and gender-based. Third, Marcus had not simply committed violence, but had also spoken his grievances aloud, creating testimony that witnesses could repeat and that gave voice to suffering that usually remained unspoken. By evening of the day, Marcus pulled Madame Vera from her carriage. Enslaved people on at least 4 neighboring plantations knew the basic facts of what had happened. By the following morning, the story had reached estates 20 miles away. Within a week, variations of the story were circulating as far as Baton Rouge to the north and New Orleans to the south. Each telling added details or emphasized different elements depending on the teller's audience and purpose, but the core remained consistent. A man had finally said no, had physically challenged white authority, and had survived at least long enough to be taken into custody rather than killed immediately. The effect of this story on other enslaved people was complex and varied by individual temperament and circumstances. For some, it inspired a dangerous hope that resistance was possible, that the system could be challenged even if the consequences were severe. These were the people who whispered Marcus's words to each other in the quarters at night, who added his name to prayers and songs, who saw in his actions a model for their own potential defiance. For others, the story primarily highlighted the futility of resistance, since everyone knew that Marcus would eventually be executed or sold to a fate worse than execution. These people saw his actions as noble but ultimately suicidal, an example of what not to do if you wanted to survive. But regardless of how individual enslaved people interpreted the story, its circulation created something that plantation owners feared above all else: a sense of connection and shared experience across different estates. The trial. Justice in a Louisiana courtroom. The trial began 3 weeks after the incident, and the verdict was never in doubt. But what made the proceedings remarkable was that Marcus was allowed to testify at all. Louisiana law did not generally permit enslaved people to speak in their own defense, but Marcus's literacy and the peculiar circumstances of the case, a white woman of significant social standing, humiliated publicly by a slave, created unusual interest that demanded some performance of legal process. The courthouse in Baton Rouge was packed beyond capacity on the morning the trial commenced, with white spectators filling every seat in the gallery and spilling into the hallways outside. The composition of the crowd revealed the complicated politics surrounding the case. Some attended out of simple curiosity, drawn by the scandalous nature of a slave assaulting his owner. Others came with darker purposes, slaveholders concerned that any leniency toward Marcus would encourage similar acts of rebellion on their own properties. And a small minority, mostly associated with churches or reform movements, attended because they saw in Marcus's actions a kind of desperate heroism that deserved witness even if it could not be celebrated openly. The prosecution presented its case first, calling witnesses who had been present in the cotton field that morning. James Crawford testified about Marcus's refusal to obey Madame Vera's order to kneel, his inflammatory speech, and his physical assault on his owner. Field workers brought into the courtroom in chains as if they might attempt escape from the witness stand provided brief confirmation of Crawford's account, though their testimony was kept minimal because Louisiana law viewed enslaved testimony with suspicion even when it supported white interests. Medical testimony established the extent of Madame Vera's injuries: broken wrist, fractured ribs, severely sprained ankle, facial lacerations, and psychological trauma that the doctors claimed had left her in a state of nervous collapse from which she might never fully recover. The prosecution argued that Marcus's actions represented not merely an assault on an individual, but an attack on the entire social structure that maintained order in Louisiana. To permit any leniency would be to invite rebellion, to suggest that enslaved people could question their owner's authority with anything less than absolute submission. Then came the defense, such as it was. Marcus had been appointed a lawyer, a young attorney named Robert Hayes, who had drawn the assignment by lottery among the bar and clearly viewed it as a professional burden rather than an opportunity. Hayes's defense strategy was limited by both law and social pressure. He could not argue that Marcus's actions were justified, since Louisiana law provided no circumstances under which a slave could legally assault a white person. He could not claim Marcus had been provoked beyond endurance, since enslaved people were expected to endure any treatment their owners deemed appropriate. What Hayes attempted instead was a novel argument that Marcus' education and literacy had made him psychologically unstable, unable to properly accept his position in society, and therefore not fully responsible for his actions, in the same way that an insane person might not be responsible. It was a defense that simultaneously portrayed Marcus as victim and as dangerous, someone whose very ability to read and reason had become a kind of mental illness that destroyed the natural submissiveness that supposedly characterized properly managed slaves. The judge, a plantation owner himself, showed little patience for this argument, but did permit Hayes to call Marcus to testify, a decision that generated immediate controversy in the courtroom. Marcus took the stand still wearing the chains that had bound him since his arrest, and his testimony provided the only moment in the trial when the proceedings transcended legal theater and approached something like truth. Vera's testimony. The victim who could not stand. Madame Vera appeared in court carried on a specially constructed litter, claiming that Marcus's attack had left her unable to walk and in constant pain. Medical testimony confirmed injuries consistent with her fall, but the doctors could not separate damage caused by Marcus from damage inherent in a 300-pound woman's body subjected to sudden impact. The litter that brought Madame Vera into the courthouse had been constructed specifically for this purpose, a wooden platform, with handles on each corner that allowed 4 men to carry her with relative stability. She lay upon it, propped up with pillows, wearing a black dress that emphasized her status as victim and mourner simultaneously, mourning for her own destroyed sense of security and untouchable authority. Her left wrist was splinted and wrapped in white bandages that stood out dramatically against the dark fabric of her dress. Her face still showed bruising from where it had struck the ground, yellow and purple marks that made her appear even more pitiable to the white spectators who had come to witness justice being served. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the litter was carried down the center aisle and positioned near the witness stand. The judge, recognizing that Madame Vera could not reasonably be expected to climb into the witness box given her condition, permitted her to testify from the litter itself, a highly irregular accommodation that several lawyers in the gallery later criticized as prejudicial to the defense. But no one objected at the time, and Madame Vera began her testimony from her prone position, her voice carrying through the courtroom with practiced authority despite her physical vulnerability. She described the morning of May 12th in terms that emphasized her benevolent intentions and Marcus's unprovoked betrayal. According to her account, she had gone to the fields that morning to personally supervise the work, as was her custom, bringing with her the care and attention to detail that made Thornhill Plantation one of the most productive estates in the parish. She had noticed discrepancies in the cotton-picking counts that Marcus had recorded, simple errors that any careful mistress would feel obligated to correct. She had called him to her carriage not to punish him, but to educate him, to help him understand how to keep more accurate records in the future. But instead of gratitude for her patient instruction, Madame Vera claimed, Marcus had responded with insolence and defiance. He had refused to accept correction, had argued with her about the accuracy of his numbers, had spoken to her in a tone that no slave should ever use with any white person. She had ordered him to kneel and apologize for his disrespect, a mild correction that any reasonable owner would impose for such behavior. And that was when Marcus had attacked her, pulling her from her carriage with such violence that she had feared for her life. Madame Vera's testimony included several theatrical elements clearly designed to generate sympathy from the jury and spectators. She paused frequently as if overcome by emotion, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief though no tears were visible. She described her terror as she fell, her certainty that Marcus intended to kill her once she was on the ground, her desperate prayers that someone would intervene before she was murdered by the slave she had treated with such consideration and kindness. She mentioned Sarah's death only briefly, claiming that the woman had died of natural causes related to pregnancy, and that she had personally ensured Sarah received the best medical care available. The lies in Madame Vera's testimony were obvious to anyone who had been present in the field that morning, but the courtroom contained few such witnesses, and those who were present in the enslaved workers brought to testify had no opportunity to contradict a white woman's account. The verdict and sentence. Louisiana's compromise. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning, with a guilty verdict on all charges. But the judge's sentence revealed the complicated politics surrounding the case. Marcus would not be executed, a decision that surprised everyone familiar with Louisiana's typical treatment of slaves who assaulted white people. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor in the state penitentiary. The verdict itself was anticlimactic given its predictability. No one in the courtroom, least of all Marcus himself, expected any outcome other than conviction. Louisiana law provided no circumstances under which an enslaved person could legally lay hands on a white owner, regardless of provocation or justification. The assault was a capital crime, and dozens of precedent cases existed where slaves had been executed for offenses far less dramatic than pulling a wealthy white woman from her carriage and speaking publicly about her cruelties. But the sentencing revealed unexpected complexity in how Louisiana's legal system processed this particular case. Judge Harrison Beauregard, a plantation owner himself with extensive holdings in cotton and sugar, took nearly 30 minutes to explain his reasoning before pronouncing sentence, an unusual elaboration that suggested he was aware of the precedent being established and the scrutiny his decision would receive from other slaveholders throughout the state. Beauregard acknowledged that Marcus's crime ordinarily merited execution, and that many in Louisiana society would expect nothing less for such a brazen assault on white authority. But he identified several mitigating factors that, in his judgment, warranted a different approach. First, Marcus had not actually injured Madame Vera through direct violence, but had rather pulled her from an elevated position, and her injuries resulted from her own weight and the ground's resistance rather than from being beaten or stabbed. This distinction, Beauregard argued, suggested something less than murderous intent, more a moment of defiance that spiraled into consequences Marcus had not necessarily intended. Second, the judge noted Marcus's education and literacy. characteristics that made him valuable property despite his crime. Executing an educated slave represented a significant economic loss not just to the Thornhill estate, but to Louisiana society generally, since literate enslaved people who could be trusted with accounting and record-keeping were relatively rare and commanded high prices at auction. This argument revealed the cold calculation at the heart of the slave system, where even justice bent toward property preservation when economic interests were significant enough. Third, and most interestingly, Beauregard suggested that Marcus's very education had contributed to his crime in ways that warranted consideration. An educated slave, he argued, existed in a psychologically unnatural state, possessing knowledge and capabilities that the system was not designed to accommodate. Such slaves sometimes developed aspirations and expectations inappropriate to their station, leading to behaviors like Marcus's that arose from cognitive dissonance rather than simple criminality. While this did not excuse the assault, it did suggest that Marcus was in some sense a victim of misguided attempts to educate slaves beyond their proper sphere. The sentence of life imprisonment rather than execution served multiple purposes within Louisiana's plantation society. It punished Marcus severely enough to maintain the principle that slaves could not assault whites with impunity, while preserving his life and labor for the state's benefit. It sent a message to other enslaved people that rebellion would be crushed, without offering Marcus the martyrdom that execution might create. And it allowed the legal system to avoid the awkward questions that might arise if Marcus were permitted to make a final statement from the gallows. The aftermath. What changed and what remained. Madame Vera Thornhill never fully recovered from her fall, remaining largely confined to her bed for the final 7 years of her life, until her death in 1850 from complications that physicians attributed to her weight and declining health. Thornhill Plantation was sold in 1845, its enslaved workers dispersed to other properties throughout Louisiana. But Marcus's act echoed through the region's plantation system in ways that made owners uncomfortable. The immediate aftermath saw Thornhill Plantation fall into decline that even Madame Vera's considerable wealth could not reverse. Her injuries, particularly the damaged ankle that never healed properly, left her unable to make her daily trips to the fields in her reinforced carriage. Without her personal supervision and the atmosphere of fear her presence created, production rates dropped as workers naturally moved at a more sustainable pace than the brutal efficiency she had demanded. James Crawford, tainted by his association with the incident and his failure to immediately shoot Marcus, was dismissed and found himself unable to secure another overseer position at any respectable plantation. Whispers followed him that he was unreliable in maintaining discipline, that he had hesitated at the critical moment when white authority needed defending. The plantation's reputation as a place of exceptional cruelty, previously whispered about in the quarters and among enslaved people, but largely ignored by white society, became more widely acknowledged after the trial. The testimony, even heavily filtered to protect Madame Vera's reputation, had revealed enough about conditions at Thornhill that other plantation owners began to distance themselves from association with the estate. Dinner invitations ceased. Business relationships cooled. The Thornhill name, once respected in Louisiana planter society, became something of an embarrassment associated with a woman who had been so harsh that her own slave had felt compelled to assault her publicly. Madame Vera herself withdrew from society almost completely, claiming that her injuries and resulting nervous condition made social interaction impossible. But those few visitors who were admitted to her bedroom in the years following the incident reported that her withdrawal had less to do with physical limitations than with her inability to face the humiliation of what had happened. She had built her identity around the performance of absolute authority, the visible demonstration of her superiority over the people she owned. Marcus's act had destroyed that performance in a way that no apology or punishment could repair. Everyone who looked at her now saw not the fearsome mistress who ruled from an elevated carriage, but the 300-pound woman who had lain helpless in the dirt while her slave spoke truth about her cruelties. The sale of Thornhill Plantation in 1845 dispersed 347 enslaved people to buyers across Louisiana and neighboring states. Families were separated as they always were in such sales. Children sold away from parents, husbands from wives, with no regard for the emotional devastation such separations caused. The auction took place over 3 days, with human beings standing on platforms while buyers examined their teeth, felt their muscles, and calculated their potential value as laborers or breeders. The proceeds went to pay Madame Vera's debts and to secure her remaining years in the declining comfort of a rented house in Baton Rouge. Marcus himself disappeared into the Louisiana State Penitentiary, an institution that operated its prisoners under conditions that made plantation labor seem almost merciful by comparison. Prisoners worked in chain gangs building roads and levees, subjected to violence from guards that exceeded anything legal on plantations, because prisoners had even fewer protections than slaves. The intended sentence of life imprisonment proved shorter than anticipated. Marcus died in 1847, just 4 years after his assault on Madame Vera, from injuries sustained in a work accident that prison records described as resulting from a collapsed levee, but that other prisoners later claimed resulted from a beating that went too far.